911, what's your emergency?
You need to send the police. He's gonna kill me. He killed all the others.
Who killed the others? Ma'am?
He found me.
Primate, now streaming.
Hey, this is Carmen Apiece, and, my buddy Jay Scott is on the hook. He rocks. Check it out.
Hey everybody, what's going on? Welcome back to the Hook Rocks, the Ultimate Rock Community Podcast. I'm your host, Jay Scott. Thank you very much for tuning in on our 2-year anniversary show. I appreciate all my listeners, all you guys for checking in, all you guys for following me. I really do appreciate it. We have a great episode lined up for you today. Before we begin, just wanted to make mention we are part of the Pantheon Podcast Network. You can check out all the latest and old episodes of the Hook Rocks, along with the podcast for Vinny Appice and Carmen Apiece, and Shout Out Loudcast, Cobra's on Fire, Martin Popoff, and Mistress Carrie. Also, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcast. Write us a review if you're so inclined. We do appreciate it. My next guest is a guitar legend, and I'm so excited that he's agreed to do our anniversary episode because we're going to have a conversation that I've been wanting to have with him for quite a while, and that is the legendary guitar player, George Lynch. What's going on, George?
Hey, congratulations.
Well, thank you, man. I appreciate it. I've been doing this for 2 years now.
That takes some dedication.
Yeah, the story goes is that my son was getting older. He was 14 at the time, and he was developing his independence as he should. So, he wanted to spend more time with his friends, and I had to make the choice, either find a girlfriend or start a podcast. So I started a podcast.
Ooh, you sure that was the right choice?
I think so.
Well, probably less ups and downs.
Yes.
More consistency.
Yes, more consistency. Absolutely. Well, I'd like to...
a long time.
Yeah, I thank you again for doing this. This is a conversation that we're going to have about your activism and your involvement in the Native American community. Before we begin on that, though, just to kind of find out what's new, what's latest and greatest in your world. I know you guys just got done with a run with Dokken under the George Lynch moniker. Is that something that you guys are going to proceed with as the name of the band, just under George Lynch?
No. We've changed it a couple of times since then, and we'll probably change it a couple more. We're in a sort of a state of flux at the moment, transitioning from Lynch Mob to whatever we're going to be. So in the interim, we were just using my name, because it's really challenging to get universal information out equally to all parties involved, meaning promoters and agents and, the publicists and, people are printing up posters and doing web guys and everything. So you really want to have a unified front and go out with one message and, disseminate that all at the same time and have it be organized. Well, it didn't happen that way. So, it's just been sort of a patchwork process. So where we're at right now is the band is entitled George Lynch and the Electric Freedom, or possibly George Lynch's Electric Freedom. We haven't figured that out. It doesn't make a lot of difference, but it does make a difference when you're doing the artwork, of course. And so I think that will stick. But the biggest change that we've experienced is that we were intended to be a power trio, and we went out and we did the shows that you spoke about with Dokken back east, and everything went great. It was fun. But I really felt a void, both physically and otherwise. I've always been in quad type band situations, the classic Zeppelin lineup, and used to having a guy right in the middle of the stage who's the focus of attention, and the rest of us are sort of satellites, in orbit around our lead singer. And so it was, since we didn't really grow up as a trio, and I haven't played in a lot of trios, it just felt a little unnatural. Not taking anything away from any of the elements involved. Great band, but so since we've added a singer who will be starting up with us. First show with our new singer will be at the Vegas show with Dokken and Lita Ford and I believe Warrant and some other 80s bands. It's a festival in downtown. If you call it a festival, I'm not sure what you call it, but it's an outdoor event, larger event. It's not a club. So in the meantime, we've got one more show as a trio in Virginia coming up. I can't think of the date, but it's coming up in mid-July, actually. It's July 15th in somewhere in Virginia.
Who is going to be the new singer?
So right now, Will Martin from Earshot.
Awesome. Now, he did your Kill All Control album, and he was also on the Heavy Hitters album, too, as well. Correct,
yeah. He sang most of the songs on the Heavy Hitters record that was released a few months ago on Cleopatra Records, Deadline Records. There's, I believe, two other singers on that record, but Will did the majority of the songs, sang the majority of the songs. And I think he did about a quarter or a third of the songs on the Kill All Control record. So we have a history, and I've always wanted to play with Will. Never had the opportunity to do it in a live context. And it just, the ideas just sort of sprang up because I was talking to him. We were talking about something else in communication, and I just thought, this might be a good fit. So I talked to the other guys about it, and everybody was excited about trying it. And so what I think this says about the band is really, at this point in my life, and I think I speak for the rest of the band as well, is that it's just really, we're at in a final analysis, we do this because we feel compelled to, and we're creative people, and we play these instruments and we love it. And it's also how we make our living, and majority of the people like what we do. So there you go. It's a win-win on every front. And as long as it can continue to be that, we'll continue to do it, and take ourselves seriously, but at the same time, not be intractable, not work our way into a corner that we can't back ourselves out of, be a slave to something that we don't feel comfortable with. So name changes can come, personnel changes will come. If the past is evidence of the future. The set list will change probably daily, as has been happening. And I guess it's really kind of an experiment and a discovery of who we are at this point in our lives, and having fun with it, as much as we did when we were starting out. So what I didn't want to do is have this be just a post 80s, post early 90s recreation of what we were, or what the world was 35, 40 years ago. I think that's somewhat sad, although I understand the value in it, and we do some of that as well. But I wanted to make it more than that. Meaning the live experience of what a good band is. At this point, George Lynch and Electric Freedom is just, be free to do what we want, and that wherever we feel the creative muse is leading us, at that moment in time. I'm not saying we're not thinking about it. We're not using our intellect and trying to, have some, manage some sort of structure. I mean, we do that to a certain extent, but we want to remain flexible and fluid. So at the moment, we've got basically a 100-song master list, and that includes, the necessary things like, the bigger Lynch Mob songs like Wicked and River, and maybe a few others. A smattering of some of the, I say, newer quote unquote Lynch Mob songs, meaning anything after Wicked Sensation or second record. So anything from the 90s or earlier 2000s up to the present. Even some reworked Dokken songs when we're not playing with Dokken. For instance, we're doing we do headline shows sometimes, and we play an hour and a half. So we'll throw Heaven Comes Down or Tooth and Nail or Kiss of Death or something, but we'll do it in our own way. Or even Alone Again, do a ballad, because Will's very melodic singer, and it can be. And then in addition to that, I can pull things from my catalog, other projects. For instance, we're doing one song, one of the songs off of Heavy Hitters. We may do something off Kill All Control. We may do something off Sacred Groove. But we could do stuff off KXM if we wanted to,
My vote is for Smoke and Mirrors.
Yeah, I mean, here's the thing: we have a pretty heavy cover list that we pull from. So we try to pepper our set with a good amount of covers. So the last show we did, Fleetwood Mac, Oh Well, Peter Green style. We did a war song that morphed into a Zeppelin song. We did a few covers. I can't remember what they all were. I think we did a ZZ Top song. I mean, we don't want to come off like a cover band, but I mean, these are songs that we grew up with. Literally, like when we were the kids in our bedroom playing guitar. This is stuff we learned from. So, we pepper the set occasionally with some cover stuff. And then the other element is the jam element, which I talk about a lot and have been trying to, include that into our live performances for as long as I can remember, back to the Dokken days and pre-Dokken days. So, I don't want to sound like I'm holding on to something that's in vain, but I really truly believe that it's a form of performance that we're good at, that I feel that I can do well, especially when I'm firing on all cylinders. My tone's good and I'm flowing. It's like jazz, it's just you're searching. You're up there searching, listening to each other, and it's a whole different thing than just going out there and re-performing songs that you've played 1,000 times and recorded decades ago.
You recently,
I think it's a vital element of what we do.
Yeah, you recently did a jam session and you paid tribute to Eddie Van Halen with a version or kind of a version of "Ain't Talking About Love" in the George Lynch style. Is that kind of the element that you're looking for?
Well, I consider that a cover done at a meaningful moment in time, because Eddie had just passed not too long ago. So But that wasn't premeditated. I mean, that again, as you mentioned, that was a off the cuff jam at the Dallas Guitar Show. Nothing. It was literally. I didn't even speak to the band before I walked on stage. I mean, we had no rehearsals, we had no sound check, and we didn't even communicate. We didn't even communicate, via email or text or phone. It was just sort of like, these guys will be there on stage. I didn't know their names for the most part. They're all wonderful. We kind of met on stage and we just took off. So I couldn't even remember what we played, but it was fun.
What was that like?
It's been a second since I've been on stage. So
yeah. What was that like paying tribute to Eddie Van Halen? You guys have had a long-standing relationship, a long-standing friendship. He passed in the fall here, and it was felt across the music community. And with your relationship with him, what was going through that like when it was announced he passed? Yeah.
I think, and I've read and talked to other people who feel the same way. We've all witnessed and will continue to witness, our compatriots passing on, and this is accelerated, obviously, recently as we get older, and the pandemic and things like that. So, it was, this one hit all of us exceptionally hard, because it was local, and so we had history, and commonalities scattered throughout our, our time together. Shared gigs and hung out and, borrowed. Well, I speak for myself, but borrowed a lot from Eddie, as most of us have. So, it was a profound, I don't know if the word is loss is the right word, but, I mean, my father passed away a few years ago, and it wasn't at that level of sense of loss, but it was the same. It wasn't like just reading about somebody in the paper and going, "Whoa, that sucks." It was much more personal than that. And every time someone passes, especially when they have a really a big component of who you are as a player, is because of them, and when that person goes away, I mean, it sort of recalibrates all your points of reality for your existence, I think, as it does when somebody close to you, in your family dies. And I think, your father dies. It's like, that was really the foundation of what created everything that you are, all those points of light and all those compass points and all those stories and all those lessons and all the blood and all those genes and then all those everything, memories, and then everything changes your thinking and how you perceive yourself and how you perceive the world and how you behave. So I think when Eddie passed, I think it was a little bit of a growing up moment for me. We're not just all the kids in Hollywood playing the keggers and the backyard parties and the clubs and competing with each other. Nobody's competing anymore. When you're considering your own mortality, it shifts. Competition shifts to a sense of shared communal thinking, I think, and the obligation to maybe do something meaningful rather than winning.
Well, you have been doing meaningful things over a long period of time, and that really is the basis of this conversation and the reason why I wanted to have this conversation with you, because back in 2015, you made a documentary called Shadow Nation, and it was about the struggle of the Native American and the history behind that struggle. And it moved me. It really did, because it was different in that it was really in it, right? I mean, you were really like engaged with those that are really affected? I mean, you saw the faces, you saw the lines on their faces in this documentary, you saw their struggle and their pain, and you wanted to shed light on it. And it was, you know, a different side of you that not many people realize there was, and not many people have really talked to you about. As far as that documentary goes, you know, when did this passion for, you know, being a political activist and going, you know, and talking with the Native American community, when did that start with you?
Well, there wasn't any one point in my life that it really, you know, it wasn't like a light switch, something switched off and switched on, or there wasn't any, you know, aha moment of realization. I was raised in a family of empaths, arguably. Parents were sort of hippie-esque and progressive for the most part in their politics and philosophies, and were always searching and reading and looking for answers, and challenged us to do the same and take care of people, you know, other than, you know, our closest circle, but for our compassion is sort of spread out in the widest circle possible, which in a sense, in some ways goes against human nature. I think it conflicts with the survival instinct to some extent. But I was always taught that, and in addition to that, it was taught to always be, you know, hopeful, and believe or even assume, I guess assumption would be the word, that 51% of people will do the right thing for the most people most of the time. There's that 51 to 49% equation that over the long arc of history, Martin Luther King said, you know, humanity will bend towards justice. I'm paraphrasing, but so based on all those things, I have always cared about and worked for, in some small way, in my own small way, and not enough, but in some way, for environmental, social, and economic justice. And at least on the personal level. And then later in life, after I got done being an 80s rock star, which I still at that point cared, you know, I still backpacked and I read and, you know, all the right stuff and had beliefs, but those didn't transcend my personal, you know, space. I mean, I didn't, you know, my thought processes along those lines didn't enter into or conflict with my rock stardom and music I was making, things like that. So that didn't happen till really, I would say, Sacred Groove, when I started thinking that I had an obligation to use my music as a vehicle, which is sort of a classic dynamic, I think. When you think in history, historically, you know, you probably conjure up some examples of, you know, people that were entertainers or actors or artists or musicians or whatever, that post, you know, the sweet spot in their career, then they grew a conscience and started to do good things. It's an evolution of their character or their work ethic and working towards greater good and those kinds of things. I think you see lots of examples of that in history. And I felt that urgency around the time that I wrote and recorded the Sacred Groove record, which is my solo album, the first solo album that I did after the second Lynch record for Electric Records. And you know, I had a few songs on that record that Cry of the Brave, We Don't Own This World, that directly dealt with environmental Native American issues and other things. You know, I got a lot of flack for those songs. I think people give me they they cut me some slack because they like me, they like my guitar playing or my history or whatever it is. And so, people give you a couple of passes, I think. And I have to agree that, listen, I'm not good at doing that. I'm not Rage Against the Machine. I'm not Bob Dylan. I'm not Hendrix. I'm not Crosby, Stills and Nash and Neil Young. I don't have this natural aptitude to translate my political or philosophical beliefs into music. I can use music as a vehicle to sort of be a mouthpiece for my ideas, for my activism. I'm actually really, really bad at it. So I have spent the last few decades trying to get a little bit better at it without beating myself up too much for not being good at it. And I still haven't figured it out, quite honestly. I hate to admit that, but and I think that the film, without trying to sound negative, I'm just trying to be realistic, is also an example of that. I probably had no business making a film, and I mean the ideas are right and they're truthful and this and that, but whether or not that's going to convince anybody to do anything other than what we're already doing is debatable. And a lot of people have done what I tried to do 1,000 times better, and with questionable results. So, the great minds and the great activists. Do they move the needle, or are we just all pushing against an insurmountable tide? A force that can maybe be subdued for a short amount of time, but in later years, I tend to just think about it in terms of its more basic components, like what drives this kind of thinking and behavior in all of us, including myself. And you have to look at yourself for signs, because we're all made of the same constituents, obviously. So that gets into another deeper dive subject. But just on the surface, I would say that, whether you're talking about Native American people or rich white people in power, or your average poor person anywhere in the world is just struggling to get by, or middle class Westerners, that are reaping a lot of the benefits of people that suffer around the world. Not the amount of benefits that rich people do, but still, they're the bastion of, they're the insulation between the rich and the poor that keeps the poor from eating the rich, I believe. So, what keeps this whole thing working and ticking, and what is the prime mover in all of this? And I think it's just people brain wiring, the way we've been wired, and
right.
Can't really change that, We're not going to collectively rewire half the world's brain.
Well, that really is
prefrontal cortex.
Yeah,
more empathetic.
That really is the underlying theme of the documentary. Is in order to improve this or help these people, we have to change our way of thinking. We have to change our way of thinking on how we deal with poverty and how we deal with taking, what our response is to taking the land from these Native Americans, hundreds of years ago. And, it's a very good, I mean, whether you look at how we deal with the environment now, how we deal with race, how we deal with anything, it's all, like you said, we're all programmed to think a certain way, and it's very hard to get out of that box and start thinking differently to solve problems, because the way we're thinking now isn't solving anything.
Well, because, there isn't a consensus. That's the thing. I mean, we keep having this pendulum swing throughout human history of evolving and devolving. And I think the larger question, historically and looking forward, is there a trend here? Is it that we can depend on? Are we evolving even very slowly, glacially, slowly over time towards goodness and towards progressing as a species? Are we going to tend to be more responsible. And I don't think so, and I don't want to sound fatalistic or negative, but I was reading some astrophysical science thing that was written up in like a Scientific American or something. And I'm not probably even saying the right words, but the gist of it is that universal, the age of the universe is, whatever it is, can be expected to be whatever it is, 13 trillion years old, whatever it is. I don't remember the numbers, but the point being that we're in about the 2/3 age point where there's a certain amount of civilizations that have had to exist and will exist, and we're at about the 2/3 point, meaning more civilizations have already existed and died than will pop up and die in the future. So, and the bottom line is, all sentient, intelligent life will kill itself, will suffer oblivion, because that's what we do. Because as any organism, our prime function is to survive and propagate the species, to consume as much resources as possible, to succeed. And I use that word in quotes. Even if it means we get to the point where we inhabit, a planet to the tune of 8 billion units, organisms, with uncontrolled consumption and uncontrolled propagation. There's no limit on how many humans we're continuing to make, which of course the number increases exponentially as your population increases. But you're living on a planet, and I say this in the film, in a finite planet with finite resources. I mean, any simple-minded, uneducated, meaning education as far as book education, but probably a wise person that's living in Papua New Guinea or in the Amazon, and indigenous person, or any person with basic human skills, mind skills, can look at those two things and deduce that this is not something that we can sustain. And I think what people are hoping for, at first I don't think people really care about, but the majority of people don't care about anything beyond their own lifespan, and really care much about anything beyond their own immediate sphere of influence, their family and kin, and maybe their next door neighbors. And less so as you go down the street, and less so as you go across the country, less and less so as you look around the world. In other words, if you ask an average person in Middletown, Iowa, if they value the life of their neighbor, if they weight the value of the person's life when they compare their neighbor, let's say, to a goat farmer and his family that live in a cave in Kazakhstan. Obviously, the answer is going to be what?
Well, they're going to say yes, right?
They're going to value the neighbor. Yeah, that puts a lot more weight on the neighbor's viability. And so it makes it a lot easier to demonize and go kill that goat herder in Kazakhstan and steal their resources and their labor and demonize them. And for what? For resources, really, because resources is at the base of everything. Every single thing, every human interaction, every thing that we do to keep ourselves alive and to give ourselves things that we need or don't need is based on resources. And that's the way. It's really very simple. People get into complex arguments when really they don't have to be complex if you distill arguments down into their basic constituents, components. Fundamentally, foundationally, what are we really talking about here? We're talking about fear and greed, which are very powerful drivers of human behavior. And they served a purpose, and still serve a purpose, but served a much more important purpose, a purpose of survival, eons ago, and now have been sort of weaponized. And I think are, in other words, when a billionaire has 15 homes and, $300 million yacht and is flying out to outer space just for a vacation while people are starving and, there's drought and war and all the, just the miserable shit that most people's lives, how they have to exist. That's morally wrong and sinful. Why are the world's religions not, most of them, standing up for this and insisting on changing this? Why isn't the Catholic Church? Why isn't the Baptist Church? Why isn't the Protestant Church? Why isn't any religion really, except for maybe, some forms of more progressive Christianity or Eastern religions, which are really more philosophies than religions or spiritualities. But for the majority of people, religions are supposed to be based on morality. Why are they not? Why isn't this their number one issue? I don't quite understand that, and I do understand that. It's almost like a rhetorical question, because the answer is they're not religions; they're tribes that are looking out for their and their own best interests, economic best interests.
Well, in the film, you show that it's a very important moment in the documentary when you're standing behind a fence and you're looking at the development of a youth detention center. Yeah. And, $43 million, I think, is what you said in the film, and how much it costs to build this, this detention center for kids. And across the street is a youth center that is basically got tumbleweeds going through the parking lot, closed. Why don't take those resources? Why don't take that money and develop a better, youth center to give these kids that live on these reservations hope, right? Because when you see the kids in this film, there's that one scene towards the end when you're talking to that mother whose daughter committed suicide, and because kids don't have any hope. They, they're faced with alcoholism. They're faced with drug addiction. Many of them probably are abused, because in that life of, in that living, that what they're doing in poverty, it does breed abuse, whether mentally, physically, sexually, whatever. And, you've got liquor stores making millions of dollars, and you've got all these things surrounding it. You've got the uranium. You talked about taking resources. You've got these companies digging for uranium right next to a reservation where people are getting sick as a result of it. And there's millions of dollars being made off of them pulling that resource out of the earth. And then, you're watching the film and you're like, how can this be happening? And like you said, why aren't people, especially religious groups, demanding that it doesn't happen?
Well, because people are complicated, and the history of humanity is the history of conquest and repatriation of resources and assets and humans, which are considered resources at some points in time via slavery. And now, if it's not slavery, it's through incarceration, or it's through trade deals world trade deals that we enact with other nations so that we can lock in, basically, but just don't have it on plantations in the South. We have it, you're a worker in Mexico or the Philippines or Southeast Asia and China or Vietnam or Bangladesh, and, you're sewing somebody's sweater for, 15 cents a day under horrible, inhumane conditions. And, I mean, it's just codified into the DNA of the economy that is our God, because that really is our religion, is money, and we call it the economy, and how it's distributed. But the fallacy is that it's a zero-sum game, which it isn't. I mean, in other words, people on a certain spectrum of, political theater have been led to believe that if somebody that was a less fortunate life than ourselves gets a break and we change some rules and some regulations and create some policies to help lift people up, that's going to detract from others, that others will have less. That this is a zero-sum game, that the pie is only so big, and for you to have more, I have to have less. That's not true. But what should happen, I think, is very simple logic, is that I call it the raise the floor and lower the ceiling theory, and that is, multi-billionaires and trillionaires, which we're approaching the point where we're going to have trillionaires, by the way, is obscene, unnecessary, and evil, is immoral and unethical, and should not be allowed to exist. So there's the ceiling. You put a cap on it. How do you do that? Through regulation and progressive taxation. It's proven to work. Keynesian economics. And then on the other end of the spectrum, the floor, you raise the floor and you increase all the elements of the social safety net that work. And how do we know what works? We'll look at places where they've enacted these kinds of policies and regimes. Benelux countries, Scandinavian countries, the country of Bhutan, other Western industrialized countries have done better at us than we have, but with better outcomes, health outcomes, better outcomes, and every metric you can think of. Inequality is really at the root of a lot of these problems that we have. I mean, that's how you address it, I think. Most simple, now how you put all that in place, I'm not suggesting how you would do that, but I'm just saying, raise the floor, lower the ceiling. That's the tagline. And you fill in the blanks. So you have, call it a welfare state. Let's see, what do you think about that word? What's welfare? I mean, look it up. How has that word become demonized? We're taking care of each other. And of course, there's always going to be some glaring bad apple examples that you can hold up and go, well, look, and Reagan did that obviously with the welfare queen thing, which is completely ridiculous, but it worked. And the thing is, though, when the bad actors or rich white politicians and CEOs and corporatists, hedge fund operators, somehow that's okay. Because I think really in everybody's minds, and not everybody I should say, but in most people's minds, there's this kind of thought that's been taught to us that we're all just temporary, embarrassed millionaires waiting to happen. And we're going to be behind those golden gates someday, living in our freaking mansion in Malibu with a golden, rhinestone-encrusted jet helicopter, whatever. I mean, we all think that, to some extent. We all have this kind of almost unconscious belief that this system that we live under is that it's possible, to advance economically, and it isn't. It isn't, and that's what people need to look at data and facts and statistics, because that proves that this country is not. It's pretty immobile. I mean, you're born into wealth. Basically, it's lucky sperm. Is what determines who's the 1/10 of 1% in the world. And I think we can do better than that. Need to do better than that so we can survive and be the exception to the historical rule of snuffing ourselves out due to human behavior being greedy and fearful, destroying itself.
One of the most polarizing individuals is Ted Nugent, and you had him in your film, and you spoke to him about how he kind of almost contradicts himself in his music and what he represents to what he speaks about on his show. And we talk about his, you talk about his activism in the documentary. And my question to you is it activism or is it brand building? Because to me, it's almost like he's building a brand and he's keeping that brand going because of the outrageous things that he sees and how what he says goes completely against what he says he's for.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's definitely a lot of brand building in there. He's got his name all over guns and bows and arrows and clothing and deer hunting blinds and game calls and, survival packages of food, and I don't know what else, dive that far into it, but I assume he has all that going on. So yeah, there's a bit of that. I'm a huge part of that, I imagine. But still, he's very passionate about, and as these people with his ilk are, and frighteningly passionate in that, like I'm passionate about what I feel. Do the right thing, and people that I know that are like that are the same way. And it bothers us. I mean, here's the difference I think between the right and the left. One of the differences is that people on the right will benefit economically, financially from their self-professed belief systems. In other words, if you work at Fox, you're getting paid. You're putting you're working government on the right. You talk about a swamp. I mean, these guys are just, their hands are in everything, and they're using legislation to benefit themselves. And it's just the good old boy network. One hand washes the other. I mean, it's arms deals. There's just a bunch of con men, they're grifters. Majority of them. It's freaking. I mean, this Marjorie Taylor Greene. She's raising more money than any other congressman off all this QAnon bullshit, and that's all it's about is money and power, which is they go hand in hand, and then they're corrupted. I mean, that's so the people on the left generally, you can't say that. An Amy Goodman or Chomsky or name a person who's out there doing the hard work and the fighting. Cesar Chavez, Martin Luther King, Fred Hampton. I mean, all the people that do the hard work. Anybody that worked with the American Indian movement. I mean, these people are putting their lives on the line, literally. And saying a lot of stuff that's very unpopular and getting a lot of suffering a lot of pain for it, a lot of personal psychological pain. So I know I went through a period of environmental activism where I was sort of aligned with the Earth Firsters and Monkey Wrench Gang and that sort of mentality, which was very militant. And I got to the point where watching the environmental degradation became so debilitating, I was getting depressed. And I had to step away from it because it was just taking such a personal toll. And I see that in the eyes of some of the people that do this kind of work. When you're fighting for the right thing, it's not, you're not doing it for a payday. And most of the times there isn't a payday there. I mean, what am I going to sell? And because I want to do the right thing, I wouldn't sell something based on that. I mean, you can buy a Sierra Club calendar, I guess, but that helps, them just pay lawyers to fight developers in court. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about Sean Hannity making, umpteen tens of millions of more, dollars a year peddling lies for self-aggrandizement and I mean, it's just insane to me. So I think also I want to go back for a second. You mentioned this scene in the film Shadow Nation where I was standing in Kayenta in front of the juvenile detention center that Obama administration had just built. It was like a $50 million in the middle of this, right in the heart of Monument Valley. And it was really, it was like this just obscene scar, glaring, just edifice of, imposition, really, of the outsiders' values on the only true Americans, the only person that can really call themselves a real American in this country is the people that were here before the Europeans got here. So, unless you want to talk about being philosophically pro-American, well, then you have to define your terms. But, the true patriots are the people that are working working at something and suffering for it, because they know they're doing the right thing, not because they're trying to get something out of it. They're trying to get something for all of us or for someone else, not for themselves personally. But this juvenile detention center was just so obscene and hard to look at. And I talked to a number of people in the community when we were staying there, and a lot of people, the men refused to work there. Get it's a temporary job, and they pay you really well. That's how they get you in, and you do whatever you do, some kind of construction work, and it's temporary, and it's gone. Now you built this thing to imprison your own children, because in the time before we imposed our government system on tribal communities, there were councils. The councils exist now in name only. They're not really. They don't do what councils used to do. Councils had people of wisdom, that people of power that were valued for their wisdom and knowledge and decision making, as long as people respected them for that. And if they failed, then they were ousted, and by consensus. No electoral college, direct democracy. And our form of democracy, comes from the Iroquois Confederation, and that's where it's derived from. Iroquois Confederation was the 7 nations in the Northeast and considered New England. I don't know the names of all the tribes, but the Iroquois were obviously one of them. But that was the construct that we plagiarized and designed the way our country, the ideals behind the way our country is founded. With some exceptions, of course, but like valuing people at 2/3 of the human being, that's kind of silly things, and white man privilege, of course, and no voting unless you're a landowner or white landowner. But the other idea that Native people historically have had, as far as the way they view the earth, is not the enemy, and that's because except for Native people have adopted certain forms of Christianity and have adopted that worldview. Historically, Native view in relationship to the earth is one of where they consider it, in a much healthier way. It's more nature-based, and they also look at every action that we do has to be considered against how that action or that behavior will affect 7 generations beyond them. And to me, that's one of that should be right up there with the golden rule. I think if you just put that in the golden rule and inscribe that in every place in the planet, and that's the overriding template for all laws and rules and behavior for all people at all times, everywhere, life would improve for most of us. Just the golden rule, do unto others, very simple, and the 7 generations rule. Those 2 things right there, we could replace a litany, a library of, laws and bylaws and regulations, and if everything flowed from that, I think that would be a paradigm shift in how how we could do a lot better and also potentially save ourselves from ourselves and each other.
Well, when you talk
rather
about
than build $50 million juvenile detention centers in the middle of Monument Valley.
Well, right, because you talk about the hope in for children in that documentary, and when there's poverty, I mean, we're not just talking like poverty that we see, under a bridge somewhere or something like that. This is the lowest form of poverty. And, the only industry, for these people are liquor stores, right? I mean, there's no jobs to be had, whatever little money they have, there's one liquor store in that one scene that you talk about where they just go and they become alcoholics and they become, whatever life they live after that. But then, with the children, one of the things we constantly hear is about how we have to do things for children and make life better for children. And whose children are they talking about? Because it only seems to me like it's a certain type of child in a certain area, because not all children have the same hope that I had when I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago, right? I mean, I didn't have to think about those things that these kids have to think about, I mean, and when you build that detention center in that town, you're basically telling them where they're going to go and where they're going to end up. It's just it's a really shitty way to position or have the government kind of like lead them down that path of self-destruction.
Right. Policy is what leads us, as you said. If you put something in place, that's where we'll go. Your mind will follow your eyes, and if you take that money and you invest it in what you want the world to be, that's what the world will be. And that's how people behave, and that's how we'll perceive ourselves and we'll perceive the world. Always going to be tiny little exceptions, but the exceptions are not the rule. And that's where data comes in, and that's where science comes in, and that's where the truth lies. We have tools to determine what the truth is. And so you're right. Yeah, tear that shit down. But then again, have real tribal councils. Again, make sovereign nations truly sovereign, meaning they can control their own resources, they control their own banking, they control their own investment. See, this are things that people don't understand on the surface, which is really vital to understanding why there is all this poverty in these places. I mean, look at South Africa, for instance. When apartheid ended because of world pressure, people just said, listen, we're not going to South Africa. Musicians aren't going to play there. Businesses aren't going to do business there. So the country got hamstringed. They said, okay, we're going to change our policies on the surface. But guess what didn't change? The banking didn't change in any fundamental way. And they made sure that was the case. So the World Bank goes in, the IMF, all the banking interests and the financial interests go in and make sure that the money still flows. So that's what you got to look at. It's always about the money. It's never about anything else, ever. Whether it's racism, whether it's environmentalism, social and economic injustice, incarceration, you name it. It's always just about where the money flows. So just look where the money goes and then reverse engineer that, and it'll tell you exactly all you need to know. So what the problems are. And having said that, let's say we erased all tribal lines, sense of color, and everybody was just on equal footing, we're still human beings, and that same behavior we're still subject to that same bad behavior, self-destructive behavior, destruction of others. The big question, I think, is, and I think that the film asks, is are we capable of evolving collectively over a long arc of time towards a better place, or are we going to be constrained by human nature to always be on that pendulum of advancing and then devolving and advancing and devolving, and be completely ruled by a history of dominating others and acquisition and being irresponsible, and short thinking as far as how we treat the earth and each other. I mean, that's the huge question right there. The most foundational question I think you can ask. Are we redeemable? Whether you're Native American, whether you're white, whether you're black, whether you're brown, whatever tribe, whatever religion, whatever worldview you subscribe to, are we capable of doing the right thing? And I don't know the answer to that. And if we're not, can that change? And I don't know that either. So really, at the end, there isn't any point being made. Sure, we should do the right thing. Will we do the right thing? No. Because I think you can look back to I think about this a lot. I mean, I was, like I said earlier, kind of raised in a somewhat hippie environment. And at least at the time when that was popular, and I ran in the circles a little bit and was very familiar with that. And that was my world. I mean, there was a point in the late 60s and very early 70s where things were very hopeful. We ended the war in Vietnam, the civil rights, reenacted civil rights under Lyndon Johnson, and the hippie movement and all this came along, and it was very powerful, and people were hopeful that this was going to be the way the world was going to go, towards more equitability, and environmental issues were going to be important, and we were going to go for peace and not war, and all these kinds of things, for the fair economy, this and that. Everything wasn't going to be based on the dollar. Other things were going to be important too. And that all went away. And that's a pretty crushing experience, and one of the most crushing experiences in my lifespan. Having witnessed a lot of different things politically, and different political paradigms and cultural paradigms have come and gone. So, we're at a point here now where it's things have really swung to the right, and but universally, and a lot of our behaviors is being manifest in very physical ways on this planet that are not easily fixed. So, it's I think there will be. I think we're depending on in some circles, hoping for a cure or a solution, sort of an easy collective solution to all these frightening prospects and problems that we have. We are self-imposed. And a lot of people, I think, honestly, simple-minded people, look to an autocratic, authoritarian leader that says they can handle everything, don't worry, and make everything right. So you get a Donald Trump. Versus the alternative, which is doing the hard work. There are no simple binary answers. All the truth lies in the gray areas, everything in the middle. Everything is, it's life is not that simple, and it's just in black and white and good and evil. And how do you understand that? Well, you understand that through being educated. Well, who gets educated? Rich people's kids, to a larger extent. Why do they get better education? Because the property taxes pay for their education and determine the quality of their education, the infrastructure, the teachers, the environment. Well, where does property money come from? What are the value of their homes? Well, if you live in Watts, which has, Greeny Greens or whatever it's called in Chicago, or Watts, or somewhere in, I don't know, Memphis, shitty part of Memphis, or some other, 1,000 different places you could live in here in America, and you're disenfranchised, and you live at, poverty level or whatever, you're going to go to a shitty school. And if you live, in Brentwood or, a million other places that are really mobile communities with high property values, you're going to go to a great school. And people migrate to these places, which also follows racial lines. But even more important than racial lines is really, I think people just want to live with their own tribe. And this creates more polarization, which I think is what we fought against in the 60s and 70s. And here we are. Because if you don't like where you live and you don't like the schools, you don't like what's being taught, guess what? You go to a charter school. You take that public money and put it into a private school. And they made that happen. Betsy DeVos accelerated that process quite a bit. And they're right. That's what they want. They want religious teaching in there, because what does religion do? Religion supports, at least the religion of the majority here in America anyways, supports the idea, many of the ideas that are interlocking and supportive of this very unfair, unjust economic system. You know, putting black and brown people in prisons at a much higher rate than white people, have people of color, Native Americans, First Americans, brown people, black people, scoring lower on every single metric in a human's life. Whether it's longevity, whether it's education, whether it's unemployment, whether it's diabetes, infant mortality, you name it. But everything on the quality of life and longevity spectrum and education spectrum is lower for everyone else but, well-to-do white people. And who's controlling the levers of power. So that's really what it's all about. And again, I think it gets back to that question. I don't mean to rant on here, but you got me going. So it's a question of the argument of a zero-sum game, meaning it's a limited. The size of the pie is limited. There's only so much to go around, and that's the lie that's being sold. That the haves have to give up to give to the have-nots. That's the selling point. If we open up our borders to allow brown people from Guatemala and El Salvador to come here so they can feed their families and do the jobs that none of us want to do or will do, for pay that none of us can, live off of. So it's not even a living wage. Why won't we agree to do that? Even though that's wrong in and of itself, why are our prisons full of brown and black people? Because we've constructed laws to rule of law, country of the rule of law, that forces us to have, prisons full of people of color. But at the same time, this rule of law we won't enact it to support almost 500 treaties that the white power structure has broken with First Americans. These are treaties, these are contracts, but yet we won't refuse to honor them because it's not convenient for us. So there's all these contradictions in all these different places that are, very evident, but will be rationalized away and ignored, of course. And it's infuriating, quite honestly.
Well, it's also based on education too, and if you're not teaching the children of this country real history or history that you for whatever reason school districts won't teach, you don't learn from it, right? And you don't understand why certain groups feel a certain way, are categorized a certain way. If you don't know about the Trail of Tears, for instance, that's not taught in your school. When you hear Native American, communities, want more or need more in terms of helping their dire situation, you're not going to be empathetic to it because you don't know the history. You don't know, what happened to these people and how they were treated because it's just not taught.
Yeah, when you understand the basic premise of what happened, and I know this is what's happened throughout history, of course, with all human beings, is they're human beings appropriating other people's lands and resources. But in our specific example, citing that, by the way, is an argument that some people will use to rationalize it and even condone it, that kind of behavior. But that's not right. That's like catching your kid stealing and say, well, and all these other kids stole or did all these other bad things. This other guy murdered somebody, so I murdered somebody. Well, doesn't make it right. We're trying to get to the point where we don't do that as much, right? Isn't that the point? So, yeah, it's just, that's my train of thought. Sorry. Go ahead.
No, it's just, we talk about what's taught in schools, I mean, the big thing right now is the critical race theory and the big controversy over that,
Right.
and now, but if you look at school districts in the state of Texas, they stopped teaching, the theory of evolution, or, and they started telling people that dinosaurs were in the Bible. I still remember having
the school board of education is really very powerful because Texas is so huge that any books that they approve are the curriculum that gets disseminated through much of the rest of the country. So they have this outward, this oversized amount of influence on what gets taught. And of course, these are very right-wing Bible Belt, regulators, people that make these decisions in the Texas Education Board. And so right there you have a problem. And then there's the 1619 thing that was being taught that got fought against. And then of course now there's the critical race theory that they're having a problem with, and it's just been outlawed or regulated in I think half the states in the country, all right-wing states, of course. It's insane. I mean, if you don't, another thing we did in the film is we tried to get one particular book out into schools, and some of the Western reservations were visited for the educators. And that was Howard Zinn's Young People's History of the United States. And there's no such thing as a truly objective writing of history. Of course, everybody has biases and unconscious biases and so forth. But the closest thing I have found to being what I could consider an objective is truthful history. And we made attempts to, distribute these to teachers that had the ability to put them in schools. But we found that a lot of the educators are restricted into what they can teach, depending on where they were. South Dakota, for instance, in the Pine Ridge Reservation, is a very conservative, Republican power structure there. And although that isn't the case on the reservations are minority and they don't have any political clout at all because they're poor. So, we found a lot of inability on the educators' part to even agree to disseminate this information as much as they wanted to because it was not allowed. So wait a minute. So on a reservation, you're not legally allowed to tell your own truthful history of how this reservation came about and who your people are, and you can't talk about the Carlisle schools, and you can't talk about the Tulsa race riots, and you can't talk about, you have to give this quote unquote balanced version of slavery and what the war was about. So, I mean, are you freaking kidding me? And everything that happened 100 years later, with Jim Crow and Reformation and all these things, just absolutely insane. Where I've been read in some places that in some text that school curriculum I was shown how the Carlisle schools and other Indian boarding schools were portrayed as being beneficial. And saying, well, although there were some negative things and some families were torn apart and they had to cut their hair and couldn't speak their language, or they wouldn't even say they couldn't speak their language, they said they were dissuaded from speaking their language, which isn't true. We were finding out there's a lot of children murdered in these schools, and there's mass graves that they're now discovering with, underground radar kind of devices. I'm not sure what they're called, but I actually visited one in Minnesota, I believe it was, and we were doing a show out there, and some of the people from the tribe invited me to this closed down Indian Technical School, I think it was called. It was a boarding school, like the Carlisle schools, and they showed me the mass graves I mean, they weren't exposed. I mean, but radar had revealed that there was something under there, and then they found hundreds of bodies of children. Now, recently, this has just come up in the news. There was a couple more that have just been recently discovered. One was in Canada, I believe. Recently, have you read about that?
Yeah, I did.
These are brutal places, and not just here in Canada and Australia, and I mean, look what's happening in China with the Uyghurs, the Muslims in that eastern Chinese province, where they're being re-educated and tortured and killed and imprisoned by the millions. But yet we look the other way because we need our Walmart.
Well, when you look at the way schools are, curriculum is taught, and how it's kind of selective memory, quote unquote, like it's taught in a way that kind of defines patriotism, right? And it kind of goes along with how people define, God forbid if there's something in a textbook that is critical about the United States and how the United States went about something and handled something. And it always gets defined as unpatriotic if you tell the truth. If you talk about things that maybe we're not proud of. When you think of your own personal history throughout life, there are moments that you're not proud of, but that's still part of your history. That doesn't mean that you're a bad person or a horrible person. It just means that you've got a couple scars, you've got some things that you didn't do so good at, And it's just when you find that people define patriotism, like they don't really know what patriotism is what I gather from when they start to talk about that stuff.
Well, again, it's not a binary thing. There shouldn't be. And people that have a certain kind of brain wiring look at their whole existence as being this simple binary good versus evil. Kind of what George Bush was kind of his whole philosophy was built on, the evildoers. It isn't that way. That's not really what life is about. So, and Tom Morello, I think, expressed it very succinctly in the film at the end. He really wrapped things up when he said, "Listen, there's two Americas. There's the America that we're very proud of, the ideals, the things that have worked. There's very positive, wonderful things about it. It's an experiment in democracy, and it's still an experiment, and it's morphing, and it's whatever we're going to make it. So it's a work in progress. On the other side of the coin, there's a lot of problems, and there's a lot of bad things that have occurred, and there's been a lot of bad behavior, and continues to be. And true patriots understand that. So appreciate what's good and fix what's bad, or work to fix what's bad. It's that simple. But just don't say, okay, I got to like everything because it's got a flag on it. I mean, what the fuck does that mean? It just means you're being a moron and sticking your head in the sand and not facing reality, Unless you like those things that most of us consider negative things, unless you adhere to racism and inequality and want brown and black people filling our prisons and the country that houses the most people, imprisons the most people, both per capita and whole numbers in the entire history of the universe. If you think that's a good thing, then okay, then say what you mean and say that that's what you're about and that's what you stand for. But don't pretend to call it patriotism. I mean, you don't get to do that. It's almost like, I was saying to my wife this the other day when driving around, there was that period with Trumpism where, a lot of terrible things were happening and all this, people driving around in these trucks that had American flags and the Gadsden flag and the Trump flag and their pickup trucks, or outside their house. And it was equating the American flag with these other things, and that's not necessarily that great, and healthy for us. And so it's shifted now a little bit, to where, yeah, you know what, I'd fly an American flag, because we've got a sane person and a sane, somewhat sane government, things have gotten better and we're kind of, doing things that are, the right way now again. And this is healthier and So I feel okay about this. But it got to the point where it's almost like they were appropriating, the people on the right were appropriating the symbol of the country to espouse their ideas. And it was just really bothersome. When you go in native country, and I think you see this in the film in one of the trailers that I'm in a couple other places, is that you see, which something I had never really seen before, is the upside down American flag. And, of course, some people on the right will scream and holler, oh, that's, whatever, that's a horrible thing to do. I go, no, what it means is it's a country in distress. And not the way people in, the January 6th insurrection would think of the country being in distress, which is self-imposed distress. But in the sense of native reservations, they have been under duress and distress since their inception, since we came to these shores, 400 fucking years of this. Try living with that kind of stress, where it's real, and it's real on every level of your existence. So what I gather from that in talking to people in reservations is that they're living this kind of oppression, constant oppression, generationally, that they're born into and carry with them that weight, which is why they have the outcomes they have, tremendous alcoholism and diabetes, and they die at an early age, and they've despondent, depressed lives, and the suicide rate is off the charts. Interfamily violence, and just horrid, because they have, like you said, they are proud of some things. And these people are the first people to sign up to go to war, to fight for their conquerors' ideals. There's some crazy philosophical conundrum there I haven't figured out yet, but I think they're warriors, and they want to be attached to something, and it is their land, It's been appropriated, but it's still their land. So, but the upside down, this part of that is that it's a land in distress in many ways. It's not working for them. So, I look forward to having more sanity in the dialogue and leading to, obvious fixes, that benefit, like I like to say, most of the people, most of the time. That should be the litmus test for any policy. Tax breaks for the rich? No. Progressive taxation so that we can have raise the floor and lower the ceiling benefits most of the people most of the time. And those are the kind of granular, kind of just boring, kind of, policy things, wonky things that really matter. They're not super exciting emotionally, but they're really, I talk to my wife about this sometimes. It's like, the practical policies that we put into place are things that can change people's lives and determine the direction of this country and the world and people's individual lives in a way that matters to people, So, if I was poor at one point in my life, in my early 20s, late teens, early 20s, and I know that I'll never forget that feeling, of hopelessness and having really no way to do anything. You could work as hard as you could be willing to work as hard as you want and dig a hole to China with a shovel. Doesn't mean anything. I know that feeling of what lack of education, lack of opportunity feels like. It's a prison. There's just no way out of it. And it's there by design. It's a thin blue line or redlining, this policy, that policy, or the way the economy is built. You're not getting into school. You're not going to get a job. You're not going to, I remember periods in my life where I'd just be not just paycheck to paycheck, but and I've been homeless, and I've been lived in my car and lived with friends and lived on the street and lived in the back of vacant houses and lived on the side of railroad tracks and hot freight trains and hitchhiking and been stuck in jail and all these kinds of things. it was an adventurous point in my life, but I was also, I couldn't do, I was really, if it wasn't for music, just, which was very unexpected, that I had a career in music. I had no idea that I was going to do anything like that. I had no idea where my life would have led me, but there certainly wasn't any help out there for me. And I was willing and did work very, very hard. But it didn't matter how hard you worked. Upward mobility isn't based on hard work. It's based on, lucky genes, lucky sperm. And that's about it. And, I'd get to the point where if I would be in the wrong place at the wrong time and get arrested or get a ticket or, that would just crush my life. I had no way to then make any money, and we couldn't find a job, and the job I had was just shit, for working for a wage that was really not a survival wage. So I'd work 70 hours a week when I had a job, but still could barely survive. So I'd be one speeding ticket away or one car repair away from being out on the streets. And there were points in my life where I was hungry. I didn't have food. Didn't have a way to get food. And just walk the streets looking for work. Couldn't find work because I had no education. Didn't really have any skills. Didn't have a skill set. So I found jobs, and factory jobs and restaurant jobs and manual labor jobs. And I was very proud of my jobs when I had a job. And I worked really, really hard. But there was no way I was going to climb any ladder. Because I was an education, ninth grade education. I wasn't going to get anywhere. And I was always, you don't have a safety net out here. So, all you need is just one bad break. Like I said, that speeding ticket or running with the cops or, anything. One hit, get laid off. I work at a factory and I worked at an aquarium factory. We're laying everybody off, laid everybody off. Well, what am I going to do? You get evicted from your apartment. You got little kids. You don't have anywhere to put gas in your vehicle. You don't have any. Now you're riding a bike to work. You don't have a job. Now you don't eat. Now you're back living with your in-laws. Now puts pressure on your marriage. Now you get a divorce. Now you're out on the street. So I know what that feels like, and it's baked into the system. That's how the system is designed. For billionaires to exist, we have to have a supportive pyramid of this underlying underclass. We have to. Unemployment has to exist. Why can't we even ask the question, why does unemployment have to exist? Isn't it arguable that we could have a system where we have 100% employment? Well, the reason we can't, that's a rhetorical question, is because 100% employment would give more power to labor. And what would that mean? That means that we could bargain for a universal wage that would be not a poverty wage, like we're talking about right now, $15 an hour. The fact that we can't get that through is insane, where the average minimum wage has stayed at $7.25 an hour for how many decades? When, 0.1% wealth has increased, thousandfold. So that's obscene, that's immoral, and I think that's the basis for a huge amount of our problems, if not all of them. Running the gamut from environmental issues, climate change, incarceration, health outcomes, the fact that we don't have universal health care, single-payer health care like we have in all other Western industrialized countries. We adhere to one of the four forms of universal health care that are out there. We don't have that in the United States, and we have worse health incomes because of it. I know this isn't what people want to hear their rock stars talk about.
Well, that's yeah. I mean, that's another thing too, right? I mean, how many times have someone like yourself, an athlete, a musician, an actor, started talking about things, and not just people that are interested in getting getting a trend going on Twitter, or trending on Twitter, or trending on social media. People that actually walk the walk and do what they say they're doing. And, we hear people say, shut up and dribble. Shut up and play your guitar.
Right.
Shut up and act. These are the same people that are against cancel culture. And what they're actually doing by saying these things to people like yourself is a preemptive cancel. Like, just because you play music for a living, or just because you shoot a basketball or hit a baseball, or, act on screen, you're not entitled to have an opinion, or you're not allowed to speak about what your beliefs are, which is, again,
I think we're not only entitled, we have an obligation. All of us
I
have
agree.
an obligation. And that needs to just be insisted upon. So fuck these people that say you have a right to have a voice. I mean, no, I actually have an obligation to give a shit. And because I'm not pretending to give a shit, and I'm not making money off pretending to give a shit, like a Fox News pundit who can, look at for instance, look at this congressman in Arizona who's holding up the progressive and liberal agenda in Washington and getting things done, like voting laws so that everybody can vote. It's the basis of our democracy. Cinema. So she was a Green Party. She was, a Green Party politician, and now look at her. So what happened? Well, I firmly believe it's just money, because there's no money in doing the right thing a lot of times, and working for the benefit of other people. There's no payoff for that, And I think that's a driver for a lot of people. And you have to sometimes look inwardly, and I've done that, and thought about myself, and I go, well, how much of a hypocrite am I? Massive hypocrite. I mean, I drive, the wrong vehicles, and I live in the wrong house, and I, and even a more nuts and bolts situation, I said, I have an endorsement with ESP Guitars for like 36, 37 years. And I have my own guitar line, my own guitar models. And 80% of those are LTDs, and those were being made in places like Indonesia and Taiwan. And where does this wood come from? Well, not historically, not from places that are green forest approved, environmentally correct wood sourcing. So I thought to myself, okay, well, if it came down to it, would I be willing to forego my royalties for these guitars to do the right thing? And those are the kind of questions you have to ask yourself. Personally, what I did was I had a discussion with ESP, and they did change their policy, their sourcing policies, where there were problems, and to where now the stuff comes from places that are more environmentally sustainable. Not 100% because of me, but I'm not trying to say that I did that, but we did have that conversation. That did happen. Does that just make me sleep better? It hasn't really changed anything. And would I be willing to walk away from the money if it came to that? And would that change anything? So those are kind of hard questions you have to ask yourself. I think, are you willing to change your lifestyle to avoid the hypocrisy of your words versus your deeds? And then how far do you take it? And does it really change anything? So I don't know. Those are tough questions. You have to ask yourself, because if I asked myself those questions and kept going down that rabbit hole, where do you end up? Where would I end up? Living in a cave, playing an unelectrified guitar, not flying in an airplane, on and on and on. I'm a product of human existence. It's very hard to not be that. And conduct yourself in any meaningful way in the modern world. So, I don't know if I'm going to go live on Golden Thoreau's Pond or something. I haven't thought about it, and I think the answer is I hate to use this word balance, but because that's like almost saying, well, split the difference between right and wrong. The halfway point between right and wrong is still wrong, right? So, yeah, it's a tough personal question, but at least we actually need to ask those questions, and if we can, just bend the course of human behavior a little bit universally. I think that would be a huge undertaking and a huge accomplishment.
You talk about walking the
awareness.
You talk about walking the walk. You were part of the Dakota Access Pipeline protests in North Dakota, and you were there. You were on the front lines. You were there when they were firing the water cannons on the protesters. And it's a very polarizing issue in this country. There's one side that believes that it hurts the environment, which I fall under that category, and the other side believes that it creates thousands of jobs, which it actually doesn't. And they also think that it blames for the high prices in gas, which it really doesn't. What was your experience there? How did you feel compelled to go and be a part of that protest?
Well, it stood for everything in my, every fiber of my being resonated with the ideas that were behind this. And I was a little too young to be involved in the protests of civil rights and against the war, even though I was up for draft and just missed out on getting drafted. But, wasn't of age to be going and demonstrating in Washington or anything. So, and since the ensuing years, I've gotten older and followed all this stuff and tried to be involved. It just felt like it was an event that just all things just sort of came together and went, this is something I need to be involved in. And just out of my, passionate belief in everything that's going on here is on the line, this is a moment. So, between my care and work for Native American issues and indigenous issues to environmental issues, it all sort of came together this one instance. And so my wife and I decided to get involved and take some time out and go up there. And it was horrifying and sad and beautiful at the same time. And the beauty part of it is being in the midst of 10,000 people coming together in almost a Woodstock kind of way to do something very unselfish and put themselves in harm's way to help each other and to help all of us and to fight for the earth. And then it was just absolutely stunningly, tear-jerkingly beautiful, sort of redeemed all my, my worldview throughout my life. It's like, this is why I believe what I believe. This is what I do what I do, because I love this. It just validated all that for me, that there were enough of the other people in this world that think this way and care unselfishly about each other and others and the earth. So it was insanely inspiring and see people put themselves in harm's way like this. It was very, it was difficult. I mean, my wife worked in the medical tents where they were actually yurts, and I worked making stoves that we had 55-gallon drums that were welding and attaching feet to and attaching stovepipes to and trying to put those out in all the different tents and structures. This huge community had just appeared out of nowhere around an idea. And that was just stunning, and I loved it. And it was a fleeting moment, but I mean, the idea still exists as people are still here. The idea that drives it is still here, is that we need to be able to put ourselves in jeopardy for survival, and survival in the right way. And these are all kind of ideas that really derive from indigenous ideas that have outlasted any of the West's ideas by centuries, or millennia. So just to see all these things in action, people in drum circles, and marching, praying, and using nonviolent confrontation. MLK, Dr. Gandhi, and others have used and advocate for. Is really seeing all these things on the ground is really stunning. And then on the other side is to see the forces that we're aligned against or we're aligned against us. And just the first thing that come to mind is, why are these forces here? And what are they defending? I mean, and these are their neighbors. So why are we being confronted like this with this kind of just diabolical force? It was just insane. What was the pictures were frightening. I mean, the reality of being there was scary. I mean, I remember there's this huge just pallets with giant boxes full of books, discarded books from libraries they had donated that were in bookstores and rolls of duct tape, and what you're instructed to do, because we had training classes in how to conduct ourselves. And one of the things was you're going to be shot with rubber bullets and other things. So you need body armor. Body armor was duct tape these books to your body. Everybody had masks. Everybody had earplugs because of a sonic weapon being displayed. Being bombarded with these microwaves and these horns that are on these giant, huge armored military vehicles that generated the sonic, just, I don't know what you would call them, 140 decibels of just, sound weaponry. It's insane. And what was it? Concrete barriers and concertina and razor wire, and these police that look like something right out of Star Wars, future space military guy. I mean, there was no human being left there to look at. And that's part of it too. They just had so much armature on, but there wasn't humanity left there. Individual identifying feature. There were just these robots, emotionless robots. And it was just fucking frightening, insane. And then we had jamming all of our cell phone and communications with these airplanes that would be overhead 24/7 during the day, and drones everywhere. There's no way to get the information out, get pictures out, and video out. There was this one hill that we would go to that we could get some cell service, but we're being watched and cataloged and surveyed, and it was just freaking insane to me. And I actually had a one-on-one with some of the police. At one point, I ran into a group of them, and I just, and they were of the opinion, some of them, that there's some of these bad actors, and they were really emotional about it. Some of these guys, you think they're all a bunch of hippies, peaceniks, but now, there's these. And I think what they're referring to, and the people that I saw there, some of these younger Native men that were just, fuck this. It's okay for these guys to bring out their tanks and weapons of war and all this crazy shit that they're throwing at us. But we go out with a fucking gas mask and a couple of things, and all of a sudden we're terrorists. Wait a minute, we're the terrorists? Are you sure about that? It was just crazy the way people think. I just so illogical.
I also,
anyway.
No, I often think too that when people are forced something like a pipeline to be built through Native American land, or even just land in general in the United States, I always find myself thinking, have they seen this beautiful country? My son and I, we do a lot of trips as a father and son. We go to national parks. We've been to Yellowstone. We've been all the parks in Utah and Arizona, New Mexico, up all the way up in Maine and in the New England area as well. And I've often felt that if people saw the beauty in Bears Ear or Moab or Yellowstone, they would be more inclined to preserve this land and protect this land, from greed and from corporations, because it is. I mean, when we do go to war and we do these things, we fight for our country. This is one of the things that we're fighting for. This is what is part of that. And when we just kind of discard it, or we have a willingness to discard it as just, well, we need to dig for oil, or we need to, whatever we need to do for resources. It just it cheapens the country. It cheapens our land in that it's not worth fighting for anymore.
Yeah, you drive through the West. You're talking about some of the crown jewels and national parks. You drive through the West, just drive through, the back roads and the byways in the West. There's huge, large expanses of just, maybe it's not, Yellowstone, it's not the Grand Canyon, but it's still wide open, beautiful, natural country. At least it was. See what fracking has done to this country. Fly over and see what these wells look like. You would not, you maybe have seen it, but it's absolutely, it's like this dystopian wasteland. Every single acre, square mile is just a puzzle of dirt roads, service roads, flaring gas wells with all the infrastructure that's built on them. It's absolutely insane, and the pipelines are there to replace other means of transporting dirty crude, the bitumen crude from the Alberta tar sands. It's not even our country, it's coming from the Dokken or the Permian Basin. At least it's coming out, from Texas, from West Texas, east New Mexico, southeast New Mexico, or North Dakota, the Dokken fields, which are getting played out because the price of gas has gone down. But these are just boom and bust economies. Pipelines boom and bust. You supply a job to lay a pipeline, the job goes away, and then what happens? You replaced all the truckers and all the railroad workers. So from a job standpoint, no, you're replacing a permanent job with a temporary job. Why would you do that? Because banks are the investors. Who makes money when these pipelines go in? All the levels of the production of petroleum, of oil and gas. And the owners of those interests are the ones that make money, the shareholders, the stockholders, the people that own the company. Those are the ones that all the money rises to the top. And the banks and investors look at where the money goes. And what kind of oil is this? This is bitumen infused. This is the dirtiest shale oil that exists on the planet. Meaning it's energy negative. It requires more energy to mine it and process it, transport it, and distill it than it does to burn it. Than the benefits you get from burning it. And then, of course, it's so freaking carbon intensive, this bitumen shale oil, that when it burns, it releases, it does much more damage to the atmosphere than, say, Saudi oil. It's a higher grade oil. It's all bad, but so you're eliminating jobs in the long term, and you're putting way more pressure on the environment. We're at 450 parts per million in the atmosphere in this planet. And that just happened in the last 100 years since the Industrial Revolution. We should be at below 350 just to survive. And all this is accelerated at an incredible pace. And so in the last couple of decades. So, guys trying to slam through a few more pipelines so that they can, flow the dirtiest oil in the world at a few 100,000 gallons a day, so that they won't have to truck it, and you can get to the processing plants and the refineries quicker and get onto the world markets. It's not even being used in the United States. This stuff is being sold to Japan and China and other parts of Europe and other parts of the world to the highest bidder, basically. It's a globalized economy. It's not going to the United States. But it doesn't matter at this point where it goes, because it all gets burned, and we all breathe the same air and live in the same atmosphere. And climate change affects everybody. There's nowhere to hide anymore. Where are you going to hide? Where are your children going to hide? Again, back to 7 generations. Where are your children's children's going to hide? Are they going to have a habitable Earth? And don't expect technology to solve the problem. Sometimes you have to actually alter your behavior, and that's what people don't want to do because they're lazy and they don't want to give up anything. Potentially for the future.
I remember I was watching Fox News. This is probably 4 or 5 years ago. And it was on like a Saturday or Sunday afternoon. And they were talking about climate change. And they were talking about sea levels rising. And one of the hosts said, well, by the time it's really going to affect us, we'll probably have technology that will alleviate the problem.
Right.
And I'm like, that's a risky bet to take, right? You're putting all your eggs in technology will save us. I don't know if I want to, go along with that. I don't know if I'm on that team that just, keep my fingers crossed and roll that dice, because it's getting worse and worse each year. And it's almost to the point where technology is not going to be able to keep up.
And, the people that benefit are the ultra rich, obviously, and they're insulated. Their money insulates them from the reality that they're creating for the rest of us, who will have to deal, with the worst outcomes, health issues, being able to eat, being able to have water, clean water, any water, fires, rising sea levels. People who are living on their mega yachts don't care about that shit. They're completely insulated. They have they'll go to you found out in that pandemic, where did a lot of these rich people go? They went to New Zealand, or they went to live on their mega yachts, or they went, they went up to, I personally know people with money that bailed out and went up to, either the islands, pick an island, where there's sort of, it wasn't really COVID happening, and they can live like in paradise on the beach until all this blows over. Most of us can't afford to do that. Or say Jackson Hole. I know a few people personally that are very well off. That's what they do. Well, we'll go to a place that's full of rich white people like us, and CEOs and ex-politicians, and Dick Cheneys of the world, and President Halliburton or this company or that kind. Average house is $15 million, and you live in the shadow of the Tetons with buffalo roaming in your front yard, and you're surrounded by other incredibly rich white people, all spaced out and COVID free. It's kind of an analog for what we might be facing in the future on a much greater scale. That these people feel insulated from the effects of what they are forcing on the rest of us due to their greed. Pipelines exacerbate that.
They do. And, in closing here, is there anything, that you're doing currently, whether a follow-up to the documentary, whether, trying to get people more involved, that you can speak about and that you can tell people about?
Well, am I doing anything actively right at the moment? No. What I have been thinking about is I don't know if I'm going to do it, but I'm thinking about writing something. I'm just not sure, people, in my line of business usually write books about their rock star careers and what happened to them in the 80s with coke and strippers and their band and other silly shit. And I don't want anything to do with that. I'm not interested in that. But that's all anybody wants to read. I'll make it, it's interesting because when I put out the Shadow Nation film, it took me about 2 years to get it out there. And it was very, very, very difficult. I could not find any way to do it. I couldn't find any way other than just putting it out myself to get any kind of distribution or anything. So obviously we were able to in a limited way, but what I found was that, and I heard this almost universally across the board when I would talk to people at meetings and stuff, and you know, they all said about the same thing. They said, this had been just a music thing. If you'd done this just about your musical career or, you know, that kind of stuff, this would have been a no-brainer. But nobody wants to hear, you know, what people think is a rich, white rock star, ex-rock star cry about the environment or the plight of Native Americans. Nobody wants to hear it. I mean, a tiny subset of people maybe, but it's not something we can bank on. And I get that. So, you know, people don't want to hear things that make them uncomfortable. It's not they pay money for it. The prospect of writing a book, I like, but I want to do it in the right way, and it would have to be about something meaningful, and truthful, and not disingenuous, and not just grabbing a dollar. You know, I don't mind grabbing a dollar when it has something to do with my actual work and my profession, but when it comes to something like that, you know, I think it's more important to just really be very self-revealing and honest, and that's the point of it. And I don't know if there's a market for that. So that's the problem I'm having with that. After my experience with the film, which was 8 years of my life, and very wonderful experience on one hand, but also very painful. I don't know if I want to put myself or anyone else through that again, but I'm entertaining the idea of maybe writing something. I'm not sure what yet.
And as far as new music coming out in 2021, I know you're always involved in projects and always doing things. What can your fans expect from you this year?
The next thing up is a solo record, instrumental record that I recorded last year. It's called Seamless, and it's going to be out this summer. Let's see, I'm going to be working on a Sweet Lynch record in the fall, which will be coming out following year. And the third thing, well, actually, we have a few more things other than that, but we're looking at KXM4, probably working on that this winter, and also in 2022. And without giving away anything, there's some pretty serious talk about doing a Dokken record, but again, don't quote me like we're definitely doing, but we've gotten closer than we ever have, and potentially pulling that together. So people might be doing kind of a reunion Dokken record here if everything, last few puzzle pieces fall into place. So take that with a huge grain of salt.
Well, my fingers are crossed for that. You know, I always enjoy all your work, you know, different projects you're working on. And is there anything new with the newer, you know, the George Lynch, you know, that used to be the Lynch Mob that you changed?
Well, yeah, it's a completely new band, completely new kind of way we're approaching the band and all this and that, like I explained to you earlier at the beginning of the interview. But the band at this point is Jason Sutter on drums, incredible. Michael Devin on bass and vocals. Michael Devin's most currently been the bass player for Whitesnake for the last however many years. But we played together previous to that, and so Michael and I are friends and known each other for a while. And we were out as a three-piece. Just actually, the show that we did most recently was with Jimmy DeAnda, and who's since gone back to Bull Boys full time. But he did that one show with Michael and I. We did a three-piece thing. And as I said earlier as well, we add Will Martin to the mix, so we will no longer be a power trio, except for the first show coming up in Virginia, coming up July 15th, which is a show with Dokken and some other 80s bands, one of those kind of regional 80s festivals. So the band is George Lynch and the Electric Freedom.
Well, George, this has been a great conversation, and it's one, like I said in the beginning, I've been wanting to do with you for quite some time. And, thank you for, allowing this to happen, because I think it's an important conversation, and I think it's an interesting one, and I think it needs to, more of these conversations need to be had. And I just, thank you for coming on and doing this.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's like I said, a lot of these things are, it's nice to mix it up as you have with music and other issues, so it balances it out a little bit, because a lot of people want to hear about a variety of topics, and I think that's healthy to be able to kind of cover a lot of bases. So thank you for giving me a forum to speak my mind about other issues other than music, or less related to music, I should say.
Well, anytime you want to come back on and talk about things that that you're passionate about and that you want to tell people about, you're more than welcome to come back on anytime.
Thank you, Jay, very much. Okay, well, look forward to the feedback, and hopefully people will start a thought process or dialogue amongst your listeners and the wider community about things that matter.
I appreciate it, George. Thank you very much. Once again, everybody, that's George Lynch. I'm Jay Scott. This is the Hook Rocks, the Ultimate Rock Community Podcast. Stay safe, stay healthy, stay strong, and we will talk again soon. Thank you.
My steed's ready to run. I got all that I need. Canteen bullets, loaded gun. The future all I see. There's a new horizon coming, but can it ever last? Got a new direction, got a new God in my hand.
Busch Light is as cold and smooth as a mountain stream. Sounds refreshing, doesn't it? Head for the mountains of Busch. Enjoy responsibly. Copyright 2026 Anheuser-Busch Busch Light Beer, St. Louis, Missouri.